All right. And dear everyone who have come to the open lectures on Freemasonry tonight, Saturday night, Saturday morning in some places of the world, or even later. I hope you can hear me. Please let me know if there would be any issues. We have almost 150 participants here online already on Zoom, which is a great success, I would say. And no wonder why, because this is a stellar lineup that you have gathered here tonight, Róbert, Péter. We are going to look forward to some fascinating introductions to the different volumes on the source publication, British Freemasonry, 1717 to 1813. And I was asked to keep this presentation pretty short, but I just want to provide you with some context because during the last 10 years, remarkable things have happened. For instance, Cécile Révauger, professor at Bordeaux University, together with Charles Poncet, published a bibliographic, a prosopographic dictionary, Le Monde Masonique des Lumières, which contains biographical entries on 18th century or the long 18th century Freemasons. It is a remarkable 3-volume work that came out in 2013. Then in 2014 came out the Brill Handbook of Contemporary Religion, a handbook of Freemasonry, edited by Jan Snoek and Henrik Bogdan, Jan Snoek being professor in religious studies at the University of Heidelberg in Germany, which also is a remarkable resource for the academic research into Freemasonry. And this book, this handbook came in 2014. And then 2 years later, we have this remarkable source text edition, British Freemasonry 1717 to 1813, that we are going to talk about tonight, where Róbert Péter is the general editor and where Révauger and Jan Snoek have been volume editors for different volumes that they're going to talk about more tonight. And Róbert Péter is certainly known to you. He is an associate professor at the University of Szeged in Hungary, and he has been researching Freemasonry and religion in Britain in the 18th century previously, and has also now embarked on work in the digital humanities. And this is quite, when this project started, it started 10 years ago when Róbert Péter was a postdoc at Sheffield University, and we got an offer at the Center for Research into Freemasonry to do a source text edition. I was then moving back to Sweden at the time, but Róbert Péter took up the challenge. And that, we have to tell you, is quite impressive, because in our times, you rarely find publishers who would like to publish source texts. So we were happy that this project was offered to us, and I was particularly happy that Róbert Péter, who has this profound knowledge in the sources of 18th century British Freemasonry, to bring together this stellar team of editors and do work on these sources and on these different volumes, and also to keep both Jan Snoek and Cécile Révauger engaged in the project, which really has been a huge advantage. And then in 2017, to finish my lineup, came this little tiny book here, which one could say is a kind of substract of everything else that the big names have been doing before, which is my own little very short introduction to Freemasonry that came in 2017. But I would say that these 4 works together, Le Monde Masonique, which provides us with solid biographical work on 18th century Freemasonry, the Handbook of Freemasonry by Jan Snoek and Henrik Bogdan, and the source text edition edited by Róbert Péter and Jan Snoek and Cécile Révauger, and perhaps also my little book, all together are a new step in the development of a potential research into Freemasonry. So we are very happy that this event can take place here on this platform, because we are absolutely convinced of that if more people are diving into the sources, and we will hear more about the different volumes, so I'm not going to say more about them now, you will find fascinating news about the development of British 18th century Freemasonry. You might think that you know everything about it, but I can assure you that this is not the case. And for instance, I mean, if we think about the work on the institutions of Freemason that Cécile Révauger was editing that volume, very important new insights into the organizational culture of Freemasonry. And Jan Snoek, who is the expert on the development or the evolutionary history of ritual in Freemasonry in the 18th century, who is pushing forward his idea of that we have a third tradition beyond the ancients and the moderns, the Herodom tradition, that, so to speak, is the starting point for all later higher degree Freemasonry. And then Róbert Péter, who is an expert in sourcing press sources of the 18th century, demonstrating to us that we know that the entire idea of that Freemasonry lived in a world that was completely sealed off from public life is it was a topic in the news. All these three important findings are to be found in the source collection. And I very much look forward to the contributors to the volume to now take over from me and to introduce the work to you. So thank you very much also for giving me the opportunity. My name is Andreas Örnefors. I'm a professor in intellectual history, currently working at the universities of Uppsala in Sweden and Erfurt in Germany. And without further ado, I would like to hand over to Associate Professor Róbert Péter, who will come with his general introduction. Thank you so much so far, and speak to you later during the.
Thank you, Andres, for this kind introduction and the history of your Freemasonry in the last decade. Good evening or good afternoon, and thank you everyone for coming. It is a great honor and pleasure for us to introduce our primary source collection in the Open Lecture series or Open Lectures on Freemasonry series. First, let me share my screen. I prepared a PowerPoint for tonight. I hope that I'm allowed to. Okay. Okay, can you see the full screen? All right, great. So, introducing the 5-volume British Freemasonry 1717, 1813, I would like to dedicate this lecture to the memory of John Slivko. John was an enthusiastic supporter of our work on this collection. And following our methodology, John intended to edit a primary source collection on 18th century American Freemasonry. John was also the founder and director of the Roosevelt Center for the Study of Civil Society and Freemasonry that also contributed to the research costs of this edition. Tonight, as Andreas told you, we will introduce the collection. First, I will get started with a general overview of the entire edition, focusing on its aim, scope, limitations, editorial principles. Then For practical reasons and technical reasons, I go on with the introduction of the debates and representation volumes so that we should not change screens. And Cécile will continue her introduction with the first volume on institutions, and Jan on the 2 volumes of rituals. The collection was the product of 6-year collaboration of researchers and librarians. And you can see there the names of the contributing editors: Rick Berman, Martin Cherry, Rob Collis, Andrew Ping, Harriet Sandwell, Susan Snell, David Stevenson, Susan Summers, John Wade, and Mark Wallace. I was glad to see that some of you are here with us tonight. Let me briefly talk about the significance and the neglect of the study of Freemasonry in the British Isles. It is well known to this audience that Freemasonry was the most popular and influential society of British origin in 18th century Europe. However, as Professor David Stevenson noted in 2011, British academics have until recently been very reluctant to study Freemasonry's role in culture and society because of ignorance and negative stereotypes of the movement and the excessive secrecy of Freemasons in the past. This is also demonstrated by the fact that the first doctoral thesis on 18th century English, Irish, and Scottish Freemasonry were all written by non-English researchers. Let me address the aim of this collection. The purpose was to collate diverse rare print and manuscript materials that hopefully provide new insights into the history and culture of Freemasonry in the British Isles between the alleged foundation of the Grand Lodge of London and Westminster and in 1717, and the union of the 2 rivaling Grand Lodges in 1813. The collection contains a wide range of documents: funeral services, sermons, orations, pamphlets, letters, theatrical, epilogues and prologues, newspaper, periodical articles, and of course rituals, some of which originally were written in cipher, but Jan deciphered them. Many of these documents are only available in Masonic archives and are not recorded in the so-called English short title catalog. It also includes sensitive texts. What I mean by this: non-Masonic scholars did not receive permission to use them, especially the higher degree rituals, in the Library of Freemasonry in London earlier. So in this sense, the collection signifies a shift in the attitude of London Library towards academic research. We sourced the documents from 17 different libraries, Masonic libraries, public libraries, national archives. Of course, the most important of all was the Library and Museum of Freemasonry in London. We have, I think, 2/3 of documents from the first 4 volume from this library. Let me talk about the principles of selections. We try to include equal number of Scottish, Irish, and English sources. This was not always possible. For instance, we managed to identify only 1 craft ritual in Scotland, so that's the only one that we could reproduce in the 2nd volume. When we introduced debates, conflicts, rivalries, we try to include and introduce both sides of the debates. And hopefully the analysis of documents foster scholarly debates and offer new perspectives on wider historical, cultural, social, and religious themes. Let me mention some of these current scholarly debates in a nutshell and put it very simply. How radical, how conservative 18th century British Freemasonry was. There are debates about the religious secular facets of British Freemasonry. Also, there is no agreement about the esoteric rational aspects of British and French Freemasonry. And lastly, as scholars do not have a consensus about the varied involvements of women in Freemasonry and their relationship to the Enlightenment project. The editorial principles, no time to sum up these, just I'd like to, I have this slide to show the structure of each volume. We have an introduction at the beginning of each volume, and all the documents are introduced in a head note. They are preceded in a head note in which we try to provide the context of the document. We have also annotations, about 6,000 annotations in the 5 volumes altogether, in which we try to identify all the persons, quotations. Of course, in many cases, we could only offer probabilities and possibilities only due to lack of information. As we try to adopt an interdisciplinary approach in the selection of sources, and also in the editorial, hopefully the edition could be used by a variety of scholars, such as students of ritual studies, political and social historians, researchers of clubs and societies, gender historians, theologians, or researchers of esoteric societies. Let me turn to the introduction of the 4th volume on debates. The watchwords of Masonic idealism, such as tolerance, loyalty, and harmony, were frequently repeated in official publications, for example, in the constitutions. We can observe a natural tension between Masonic idealism and the actual practice. Masonic practice is concerned with Freemasonry in action, that is the lived experience of Freemasons in their lodges. Naturally, Masonic practice is much more ambivalent and contradictory than the apparently reasonable and acceptable nature of Masonic idealism. The aim of this volume was to reprint sources concerning internal and public conflicts, rivalries, quarrels, and feuds surrounding Freemasons. We try to include the attacks and defenses where it was possible to provide a balanced picture. We can categorize these debates and conflicts into 5 categories: religious, social, political, financial, and legal disputes. Of course, there are many overlaps between these debates in Masonic publications. And the types of documents, we have pamphlets, sermons, orations, and speeches. As for the significance of these documents, I'd like to first stress that I think they are important because we can listen to the individual voices of Freemasons who defended or criticized their own grand lodges. We also reproduced overlooked attacks and vindications. And the vindications of Freemasonry are not only important as attempts to refute accusations regarding the fraternity, but they are significant in highlighting the self-perception of Freemasonry from the perspective of individual Freemasons. They reveal what motivated so many people to join lodges in this period. The defenses also demonstrate what Freemasonry meant to the members. The documents also offer new perspectives and narratives of rivalries, which were often ignored by Grand Lodge historians. It provides novel evidence for the religious, social, and political inclusivity and exclusivity of lodges. I'd like to offer 3 examples from this volume to illustrate what I have been talking about so far. The first document is concerned with a Scottish political and legal dispute, the petition and complaint. This is a really rare book. We have only 4 copies of this document. And this book depicts a quarrel between the Whig-dominated Grand Lodge, represented by James Gibson, and the Tory John Mitchell, who proposed in 1807 that the Grand Lodge should send a Masonic address to the king. This was absolutely common in this period, even in the 1790s, but the Grand Lodge did not approve Mitchell's request, backed by a Tory minority. So the political rivalry resulted in a trial where the Tory Masonic faction was accused of a conspiracy to destroy the Grand Lodge. And all Freemasons who were associated with Mitchell were expelled from the Grand Lodge of Scotland and created a separate organization. And this went on, this conflict. It resulted also in a legal trial as well. And it ended with a defeat of the Grand Lodge of Scotland, and it defamed Scottish Freemasonry as a whole. There is, I'd like to mention yet another conflict from Ireland, from almost the same period, from the early 19th century. And this is discussed in the inquiry into late disputes among the Freemasons of Ireland. We have only one copy of this document in the Freemasons Hall Library in Dublin. And this book pamphlet is concerned with the exclusion of Ulster Masons from the charitable fund and its use for uncharitable purposes. It was a conflict basically between the Grand Lodge of Ireland and Ulster Masons at that time. Although this document is written from the perspective of Ulster Freemasons, they were not saints at all. For example, they appointed grand officers without their consent. It is interesting to note that this document is or was known by the official historians of Irish Freemasonry, such as Philip Crossall. Actually, he transcribed the entire book. That's how I managed to identify it in the Library of Museum of Freemasonry, but he failed to include its arguments in his book on the very same subject. So the result of this conflict was that a new Grand Lodge was again established, the Grand Lodge of Ulster, although it was a short-lived Grand Lodge. So despite Masonic idealism, in practice, Freemasonry was affected by the political, social, religious divisions of real life. These two examples, these two disputes were not only concerned with Freemasonry per se, but can be seen as manifestation of contemporary social, economic, and political tensions and anxieties. And let me refer to another document from this collection, A Vindication of Freemasonry. Earlier, I emphasized why they are so important. The title of this document is an answer to the Pope's bull with an indication of the real principles of Freemasonry. This is a reaction to the second papal bull that came out in 1751, and it was written by Bernard Clark, who was an Irish poet and young schoolmaster. Let me quote two passages from this document. In this school of reason, very important, very early case of this definition of Freemasonry, school of reason. The good Mason feels his heart warmed by the blessing his art bestows. Friendship, benevolence, and mutual love exclude the anxiety of care and every selfish design, whilst all act in one common interest there. They feel the suffering of an honest, afflicted brother, and according to his necessity and their ability, they cheerfully contribute to his relief. Let me offer an example for this relief, a charity in action. And as far as I know, there are many members, Turkish members in the audience, and it might be of interest to you that two Turkish Muslim shoemakers were admitted into lodges in Edinburgh in 1718. And there is a record, a mention in the minutes of St. Luke's Lodge in the same year that they helped, assisted these two Turks during the lodge meetings. Furthermore, a member of St. David's Lodge, John Kay, also gave an account of these two Turks and their contribution to Freemasonry. Let me quote this short passage. They were concerned to have a very competent knowledge of Masonry. To assist them on their way to their native country, they were supplied with money from the funds of most of the lodges. They received some from several gentlemen and a present of 10 guineas from the Grand Lodge of Scotland. All right, let me turn to the last volume, Representations. The aim of this volume was to collate press material about the different representations of Freemasonry in the British Isles and its influence on British association culture. Despite its alleged secrecy and the performance of rituals in a private space, 18th century Freemasonry was much more visible and transparent in the public sphere than the present-day fraternity. Because of the loss or lack of original records, including membership lists and lodge minutes, often press sources provide the sole information about a particular lodge, event, or member. The first step of the systematic research of the press coverage of Freemasonry was to create a database. This database contains the bibliographic details of almost 12,000 articles coming from 9 libraries and archives, the majority of which cannot be found by traditional searches in digital archives because of the very poor optical character recognition of the images. We divided these we could publish only 5% of these articles, but 500 articles altogether, and we divided them into thematic chapters such as admissions and lodge meetings, processions, edited by John Wade, theater, edited by Andrew Pink, debates and conflicts, women, and British fraternal societies and the response to Grand Lodge Freemasonry, edited by Rob Collis. Admissions and lodge meetings. This chapter sheds new light on the Masonic membership of several people, including John West, who was a fellow of Royal Society. But it must be stated that these articles are not only concerned with the admission of British and Irish Freemasons, as there were many foreign visitors in the British lodges. One of them was Antal Pál Esterházy, who was the earliest known Hungarian Freemason who was initiated in a lodge, in a French lodge in London in 1713. Hitherto scholarship assumed that the first Hungarians joined Masonic lodges only in the 1740s in Vienna. Theater. This is really a very interesting theme, a thread, and references to the theater can be found in at least 3 chapters of the last volume. Of course, in the theater chapter, also in the procession chapter, and in the last chapter, which is related to the relationship between Grand Lodge and other fraternal orders. And this chapter illustrates the so far largely overlooked close and thriving links between fraternal orders and the theater. So not only Freemasonry, but other fraternal orders had a very close relationship with the theater. Masonic theater visits form parts of the festivities from the election of a new Grand Master. Freemasons assembled at the home of the Grand Masters and accompanied him a public procession to the theater and the Grand Feast. John Wade reproduced many ignored accounts of these processions, characteristic of Freemasonry. Freemasons also sponsored and attended benefit performances for a local Masonic actor with specifically commissioned prologues and epilogues. And so they financially aided poor actors. These chapters reveal the Masonic membership of many actors and theater managers for the first time. The last chapter that I'd like to talk about tonight is the chapter on women. This chapter highlights the involvement, the ways and the extent to which women were involved in Masonic activities. For example, women were invited to Masonic feasts, balls, breakfasts. They were even asked to present Masonic epilogues in theaters. And Some of the highlights of this chapter include references to English all-female or mixed-gendered occasional lodges from the late 1750s. I'd like to mention just two references. The first one is from an article from the Morning Chronicle and London Advertiser. Several ladies of the highest rank determined to form a lodge of Freemasons upon the plan which Captain Smith has given in his new work. In the 1780s, some progressive Freemasons, such as George Smith, who wrote the work mentioned in this article, The Use and Abuse of Freemasonry, tried to advocate the reformation of the fraternity. For example, Smith did not accept the exclusion of women from the organization and tried to eliminate this ancient custom that barred women from lodges. And this could have motivated these lady Freemasons to form a lodge. The other article is concerned with a grand Masonic celebration that was organized by Thomas Dunkerley, really a famous Freemason in the second half of the 18th century. This meeting took place in Essex, in Braintree, in honor of Queen Charlotte's birthday. It is just a typical meeting with a procession, a sermon, a collection, a feast at the end. But the end of the article is really fascinating and very interesting. Let's see what we can read at the end. Several ladies in this country formed a select party in this town and dedicated a lodge to Urania in honor of the day. This reference is really important and significant because we don't know any other Masonic societies that admitted only women before the early 20th century. Although these press accounts refer to occasional meetings of lady Masons, they are remarkable. We know very little about what happened during this meeting. We have the membership lists of those lodges who participate in these grand celebrations. Also, there are references to the correspondence of Dunkerley and several other leading Freemasons in this country to this meeting, so we can reconstruct the membership of those lodges, and we can argue that perhaps the wives of these members established this Urania Lodge in 1787. The collection also reveal, or we have press articles that reveal the rich array of mixed sex and all-female paramasonic societies. As Rob Collis and Andrew Pink demonstrated, there were several societies in the 18th century that also admitted women. For example, the Oak Society, the Modern Masons, but the Barlekins admitted both sexes as well. And as many essentials of modern Freemasonry emerged in England, the history of Freemasonry in the British Isles was often written from an Anglo-centric perspective. And the collection reveals some Scottish and Irish firsts. And let me mention some of these firsts. The benevolent theatre performances started in Dublin 3 years earlier than the first such theatrical performances took place in London before a specifically Masonic audience. The earliest Masonic magazine was launched by Irish Freemasons in the 1790s, and the office of Grand Chaplain was introduced in Scotland 16 years earlier than the office was introduced in England by the Grand Lodge of Moderns. Thank you for your attention, and I'd like to give the floor to Cécile to introduce the first volume, and I stop sharing the screen.
Yes, indeed. Now it is Cécile's turn to speak to us. I hope everything is fine with technology. Cécile, are you with us?
Well, I'm with you. I'm just trying to share my screen, although I do not have as many slides as Robert, so They will not start immediately, but at the moment, I seem to have a little, well, oh, here they are, right? Can you see them? I think you can probably, okay.
Not yet. You have to mark, no, you have to mark the space that you're going to share with us and then share screen.
Yeah, but that's it. Do you have it?
Screen. Yeah.
Don't you have it?
No.
Oh. Well, I don't know. Sorry about that. If the worst comes to the worst, I know Robert has them, but that would be a problem.
All right.
Why doesn't it work? I'm very sorry. I try to have some training, but I have them on my screen, but you obviously don't have it. Oh, that's
no.
Okay.
You maybe have to press on the share screen button. Yes.
Again, yes, maybe I didn't have it. Yeah, here we are. I think now you should have it.
Yeah.
Yes. Fine. Okay. I no longer have it.
Sort of.
So where is it now?
No, we can.
Can you see?
Personally, I only can see parts of. Yeah, if you click there and. Now we see perfect.
You see it now? Okay.
Here we go. Now we can see, and if it showed from the start.
Okay, fine.
So
that's it.
If you click on that one.
Yes, that should be fine. Okay, no, that's it. All right.
All right.
Yeah. All right.
Perfect.
So,
excellent. Here we go. Wonderful. Okay.
Can you hear me too? All right. Well, first of all,
yes.
I would like to wish you all a very happy new year. Right. Very happy new year, and to thank again the organizers of OpenLFM to, keep us united in this time of pandemics. And thank you, Andreas, for your very kind introduction. All right, so, well, as Robert just explained, I coordinated the volume on institutions, and we tried to present rare documents which could help understand both the significance and mechanisms of Freemasonry as an institution. Therefore, we concentrated on bylaws, constitutions, regulations of the Committee of Charity, official charges which were delivered at the initiation of new brothers, at the consecration of new lodges, songs, Masonic certificates, also funeral rituals, etc. Now, at the time in England, of course, there was essentially one Grand Lodge in England from 1717 or 1721, as the latest research by Andrew Prescott and Susan Summers have just showed. So let's say 1721. And a second one from 1740s onwards, the ancients, of course. The Grand Lodge of York had virtually disappeared. So indeed, we had two limitations in this volume concerning the institutions. Well, the first one being that most of the sources available for this volume belonged to the Grand Lodge of Moderns. And yet, as Robert explained, and as has been said a lot, well, Freemasonry in the 18th century is a tale of four nations, right? England, Wales, Scotland, and Ireland. So we were aware of that. We tried to introduce some sources from Scotland and Ireland, but the majority in this volume belong to England. Now, what about the significance? Well, the great variety of texts presented here give us really an inkling of the institution itself. So here, essentially the Grand Lodge of Moderns, but also of everyday life in British lodges. Members were actually learning to use democracy. They were training for elections, and they had to learn how to behave inside and outside the lodge, right? It was in fact a practical experience in sociability, I would say. Also, we have an inkling of the main tenets of Freemasonry through the different charges and orations. And we can see that in most of them, the values of the Enlightenment are extolled, as I shall try to show in the last point of this presentation. And as for all institutions, well, there were challenges. So challenges coming from outside and from inside. From outside, of course, you are all aware of the Pope's Bull of 1738. And here, so Róbert explained that this is addressed in one of his volumes, but we also have a reference to the Pope's Bull in the Pocket Companion edited in this volume in 1738. And of course, then another example was the 1799 Unlawful Societies Act, and which tried to limit the liberties, of course, of Freemasonry, but in fact, which exempted all lodges and friendly societies from the ban put by the government on all associations. And so you will find in this volume the actual articles referring to Freemasonry in the 1799 Unlawful Societies Act. Also, we have some cross-references in this volume because we can see that, well, the piece edited by James Malala in Dublin in 1792, an essay on the origin of Masonry, is almost word for word the same as the beginning and first foundation of the most worthy craft of Masonry, printed in London in 1749, for instance, you see. And then, well, there are other examples which I have no time to quote here, but for instance, you find several references to the inauguration of Freemasons' Hall in at least 2 or 3 of the texts printed in this volume. Now, so, of course, the challenge was to conciliate variety and coherence in the types of documents selected. So we tried to do that, and we tried to do that thanks also to our numerous exchanges among the contributors of this volume. So let me first start with Martin Cherry's A List of the Regular Lodges as Constituted in 1725. And so this is, of course, a remarkable document, which is very precisely commented upon by Martin Cherry. And let me say that we were very lucky to have on board both Martin Cherry and Susan Snell, librarians of and archivists of Freemasons Museum in London, Freemasons Museum in London, and Museum of Freemasonry, if I get there. And Susan actually gave us an account of the institution and proceedings of the Royal Cumberland Freemason School, which was then a charitable institution patronized by the Duchess of Cumberland, and which aimed at the education of female orphans. So they had to be related to Freemasons. But here, this is a very concrete example of how a Masonic institution worked and the kind of regulations it gave itself. Another example is the certificates produced by the Grand Lodge of England, and which helped brethren travel. So when they traveled, thanks to those certificates saying that they had been admitted master in such and such a place, they could be easily admitted in a foreign lodge. So here you have an example, and Harriet Sandwell edited 2 of those in this volume. I would also like to refer to this real treasure trove, which is the Masonic Museum. And the Masonic Museum is a collection of songs, selected songs, about 100 of them. They were used in several lodges, repeatedly used. And Andrew Pink, who himself devoted his thesis, his doctoral thesis, to music and Freemasonry, was really, well, I mean, the best specialist to discuss this Masonic Museum. Also, I would like to refer to Susan Somers, who edited in this volume 2 charges by Thomas Dunkerley. Now, you remember that Thomas Dunkerley was thought to have been related, of course, to the king, and this was totally discarded later. But he was, I mean, he gave those 2 charges, which are really different, and one of them was given really in front of the ladies in Marlborough, and we know that Dunkerley himself, as Susan Somers proved, was rather in favor of the presence, let's say, let's be very, very careful, but let's say of the presence of women, right, inside or near the lodge. Let's put it that way. So those are also 2 very interesting examples. Now, I myself tried to select some original pieces such as Meeson, an introduction to Freemasonry. Now, this is one of the rare examples of moral geometry, what he called moral geometry. Now, if you want to have a read, I'll let you have a look at those for 2 minutes. Sorry. Oh, now I've lost it. Here we are. Let the right line be any social virtue. You see, the right line. And then he speaks of their sincerities will be equal, but it's almost everything is put in terms of maths, geometry, equations. And I must admit, we had quite a hard time editing that one, because especially as I'm not at all a mathematician, and I was a little out of my depth as far as maths and geometry were concerned. But what is really interesting is the way Meeson at the time tried to study everything from a scientific point of view, from a very rational point of view, and to discuss in terms of geometry, just as the main philosophers of the Enlightenment would discuss geometry at that time, the spirit of geometry, in French, l'esprit de géométrie. Right, and finally, I would like to highlight one piece which is particularly interesting, which is the Principles of Freemasonry Delineated, which was attributed to Truman in 1777. Well, it is a 300 book, so a 300-page book, sorry. So of course we couldn't edit all of it. You know, we tried to edit as many complete works as possible. So you will find a lot of short pieces which are entities of 20 pages or so in this volume. But here, of course, we had to select an extract. And so we selected this charge. Well, I selected this charge delivered at the Union Lodge at Exeter at the initiation of a Freemason. So it was given at Exeter, but probably it was given in several other places. And so it is typical of the kind of charge which would be delivered to a newly initiated brother. Now, some parts of his charge are, I found quite interesting, were actually translated from the French, which shows that there was, you know, a lot of interaction between France and Britain at the time. But well, this is just part of it, a parenthesis. Well, what, so I would like to, you know, to insist a little on this, on what he actually, sorry, what Truman actually tried to highlight. You see, he said, the qualifications necessary to form a worthy member of our order are wise philanthropy, pure morality, inviolable secrecy, and a taste for the polite arts. So those are really, this is really typical of the values of the Enlightenment. And then, of course, he used also some Masonic language, such as Masonry orders us to live within compass, always to act upon the square. But what I really like is this. It is not gloomy, right? It is not gloomy, but it forbids intemperance and encourages rational mirth and innocent pleasure, right? So really, Masons should not be stern people, right? They were there for the fun of it too. This is almost what is implicit, and I found this interesting. Well, and of course, more seriously, we all remember that happiness was really one of the key values of the Enlightenment, because before that, in the 16th or 17th century, happiness was not considered as a philosophic value, right? But in the 18th century, it was considered as very important as such. Of course, do not forget the Declaration of Independence and the pursuit of happiness. Right, and finally, I don't want to be too long, but I've almost finished. He insisted on the inclusive religion, right? Let a man's religion or mode of it be what it will. We do not, okay, I can't read it now, sorry, in my screen. We do not exclude him from the benefits and advantages of our order, provided he believes in the glorious architect of heaven and earth and practices the sacred duties of morality. We are directed to expand our hearts with the most generous sentiments, to root out bigotry and stop the cruel hand of persecution. So persecution, we are in the 18th century, and probably, well, he has the Inquisition in mind. And then, come then ye Jews, Mahometans, ye faithful followers of virtue, and in every faith of every faith and clime, come to us, and we will, with the brother's arm, receive you. So this is really the spirit of religious tolerance and universalism, with this beautiful sentence: the whole world is but one great republic, of which every nation is a family and every particular person a child, right? We wish to unite all men of an agreeable humor, right? Probably no time to read it all, but look at the end, you know. From such, every nation may draw solid knowledge, and all the subjects of different kingdoms may conspire without jealousy, live without discord, and mutually love one another without renouncing their country. So universalism, but of course nationalism is quite compatible. It's just narrow jingoism, which should be avoided, right? But universalism is extolled. So I think, well, we couldn't find a better example of the values of the Enlightenment in a Masonic text. Thank you very much.
Wonderful, Cécile. Thanks a lot. That was most fascinating. The last quote, of course, being re-quoted from Ramsay. So this is one of the first English translations of Ramsay's oration. What year was it, Cécile? From when was this text?
Exactly,
which text was it?
Sorry. I think it's 1777, I said, didn't I? Yes, I think so.
Oh, great. Wonderful.
Yeah.
Perfect. I will look it up in the volume. Sorry for taking time, because we have a tight schedule.
No, thank you.
And we have yet another fascinating.
Reminding us of Ramsay, because I tend to be
yes, exactly.
a little critical of Ramsay sometimes, but you are right, absolutely right.
Yes. We have another most fascinating presentation ahead of us, which only demonstrates how much in depth you can go with this with these 5 volumes. So it's also my great pleasure to ask you, Jan Snoek, to present your findings and your work on the 2 volumes related to rituals in British Freemasonry in the 18th century. So I open the floor for you, Jan, please. Oops.
Does he accept it? Do you see my PowerPoint presentation?
No, we don't. And there's a strange surround sound that is Now we see it.
Now you see it. Hey.
Yes.
Okay.
But there's some background noise. Maybe I will turn my microphone off and then. But you have to turn on the presentation. Yes. Now we can see.
You see the presentation now, and you can hear my voice.
Yes.
Right. So we are heavily running out of time, but I still have to present 2 volumes. There's no way around it. I will do so as fast as I can. So volumes 2 and 3 of British Freemasonry are on now. Come on. Yeah. Volume 2 is about craft rituals. And the aim was to give scholars access to texts of rituals, not genuine exposures, of which there are very few. I know only one British real exposure, Shibboleth of 1765, of which there is a modern edition, so I leave that out. I'm just dealing with so-called pseudo exposures, rituals which disguise as exposures, because you had sworn not to write down the ritual, but you need a ritual book. So you publish it and you do as if it is an exposure. So texts of rituals that are hardly ever mentioned, such as English translations of French texts, and texts that are usually supposed to be fakes. Those are the texts which are rarely mentioned, let alone shown in print, or that are mentioned, but difficult to find or to access, and of those there are very many. On the other hand, I wanted to show whether or not there is much variation in space and time. So if I look at first editions, they all come from England, but later editions are often published in Scotland or Ireland, some in Scotland, many in Ireland, and I wanted to know if there are differences in those editions, and then if there were differences in time. So if I compare first editions with later editions, are they still the same text or have they modified them? The significance is that the translations influenced the development of British rituals. Someone else is talking. The translations influenced the development of British rituals, which is very clear. In the case of the first translation, which appeared in 1760, which introduced the French way of describing rituals, which is no longer just catechisms, but a real description of the ceremony. And from that first publication in 1760 onwards, we see that all the rituals, English rituals, published in the 1760s, follow that scheme. Then supposed fakes may be real after all. They show the wide range of variation which we have in the beginning. Standardization of ritual appears only in the course of time. At the same time, we see a new development of variation on that central form, which is more or less canonized. Cipher texts were given in deciphered form in order that normal human beings can read them. They were not supposed to be read by outsiders. They were only for insiders, but we want to be able to read them all now. So I gave them in deciphered form. That concerns both the publications of Brown and of Finch. And as to the variations in time and space, they turn out to be minimal. There is maybe one case where a Scottish small ritual was probably for a Jewish lodge, and that gives then some variation in the form, but that's the only serious case that I found. For the rest, there are of course misprints, etc., but normally the reprinting of Masonic rituals is very, very conservative, which is actually not a surprise, I think. As to types of documents, all documents included in this volume, volume 2, are printed texts. We have 4 translations from French texts. We have 1 supposed forgery. We have 4 non-first editions. And we have 1 Irish and 1 Scottish edition. I give 2 examples. The first is Slade's booklets from 1754. I take it, among others, because it falls in the interval between British Masonry Dissected from 1730 and 3 Distinct Knocks from 1760. It's generally supposed that in this interval there were no English publications of rituals, but there is this booklet of Slade. The central symbolic theme is not the Temple of Solomon, the building of the Temple of Solomon, but the building of the Tower of Babel, which made it, in the eyes of many later Masons and scholars, by definition a forgery, which I think doesn't need to be the case, because we will see there is, beside the moderns and the ancients, a third English Masonic tradition, and there the Tower of Babel is also always present. In this ritual, the builder of the temple, the Tower of Babel, which in the Bible is called Nimrod, is here called Belus, and he is represented by the Master of the Lodge. At least 2 scholars in the past have warned not to dismiss it as irrelevant to the study of Masonic ritual. They assumed that there might have been a lodge which has really worked with this ritual, or that at least it may have influenced mainstream Masonic English ritual because of its popularity. There were at least 6 numbered editions and a number of not numbered ones, pirated editions. So it had a certain amount of popularity. This is the title page, The Freemason Examined, or The World Brought Out of Darkness into Light, etc., by Alexander Slade, published in London in 1754. My second example is Finch, a Masonic treatise, his big book, a ritual book from 1802. It's really a big volume. After the publication of the rituals of the ancients in the 1760s, there is a kind of silence until there comes a new current in the Grand Lodge of the moderns, which by their participants are called the lectures. It is in the first place Preston who introduces the form. It are big catechisms, but the answers to the questions are very long, too long for normal members. So you have to have a trained team to present those lectures. And there are 2 people, Brown and Finch, 2 authors. In the vicinity of Preston, they seem to have known each other's work at least, but I think they knew each other personally also, who are then producing publications of this type of ritual texts. Preston published of his lectures only the non-esoteric parts, the parts that everyone was allowed to read. But there were certain parts which contained what Freemasons regarded as secrets, and those parts he suppressed. But he presented those lectures in his lodge in full with the secret parts. Now, Brown and Finch are especially important for the English ritual, which we now know as the Emulation Ritual. It's one of the 2 forms that we have at the start. That's after 1816, when the new rituals for the United Grand Lodge were accepted. They all reflect, also the works of all 3, the lectures they present, all reflect the workings of the moderns at that time. Now, the moderns were the more intellectual Grand Lodge, and they were becoming, during the 18th century, more and more adherents of the philosophy, the philosophical current that started at the end of the 17th century, but became more and more popular during the 18th century, the philosophical current, which is known under the title Reformation of Manners. Masonic ritual was no longer seen as an initiation ritual, but as Freemason was seen as a school in proper manners. You had to learn proper manners by repeating things the right way so that you internalize that. So it was no longer the first time ritual of your initiation which mattered, but the constantly being present at each new performance so that you more and more internalize the message. All their publications from all three are highly ciphered. They are really unreadable for normal people. The publication by Finch, a Masonic treatise of 1802, is, as far as I know, never published in a full deciphered form. So this is the first time that is published in a complete deciphered form. The deciphering as such, or the transforming the text into something which is readable in a way that you regard as normal, is extra complicated because Finch put in the first part of his book all the questions, and in the second part all the answers. And in both parts, he ordered the sections of the lectures in random order. So you really have to know where to look to find the answers to the questions that belong to the questions, etc. So it's not just deciphering, but then also reordering the material. You see here the title page, and I enlarged the central part of the title page so that you can see here at the top one line of coded text, ciphered text, and at the bottom another one. But in order to show it even better, I took a random page from his questions part. This is the start of the third section of the first degree. And you see left how it looks like in the original printed, the original edition, and on the right side the way I have presented it in our volume. And there you see that I use two letter types, Times Roman, which represents the text which is readable in Finch publication, and Arial for the text which I had to decipher. So you can always see what is my interpretation and what was literally in his text. We go to volume 3. The aim of the material in volume 3 is to give scholars access to, if possible, all English Haredim material from the 18th century, relevant to rituals, so texts of rituals themselves, but also material which is not ritual, but relevant to the ritual material. Most of this material is difficult to find, and if you can find it, it's difficult to access. Some examples of higher degrees were published in this volume as well. Both English and Irish were the idea. We had loved to include Scottish material as well, but we didn't find it, not from this early time period. The Irish material available is abundant, but still has to be, studied by specialists in order to bring order in the chaos. The significance of the Haredim material is that the existence of the Haredim was silenced by both the moderns and the ancients. They didn't want there to be any Masonic activity outside their two Grand Lodges, and that there was still at least a third current sometimes associated with the York Grand Lodge, which existed to a certain point in time, but this tradition as such existed much longer. Yet it existed, and it influenced the rituals of the United Grand Lodge as they were approved in 1816. There are hardly any scholarly editions of primary material. Most of the material has never been reprinted in a modern edition. And most secondary literature is not reliable because it is often not based on knowledge of the documents, because the documents are so difficult to find. As a result, the whole stuff is mostly neglected by scholars, which generally regarded as mainly legendary rather than based on something really existing. And when we come later in the tradition, we come with William Preston again. He had his own Howardine order, a secret society within a secret society. And the manuscripts written by Alexander Dalziel are a big volume for the text for the first degree, a big volume for the text for the second degree, a big volume for the texts for the third degree, and then still two big volumes for the higher degrees, which I didn't even include. So I included only material for the craft degrees, and still the material, the transcripts of material from those Alexander Dalziel manuscripts alone covers 100 pages in volume 3. And that is not complete, it's a selection. But it simply, I couldn't simply defend spending even more pages on it. Hardly anyone really read those enormous, abundant, sizable manuscripts. I know that at least two people did, Neville Barker Cryer and John Yarker, which by hardline scholars are both regarded as not hardline, which regrettably is true. They were very erudite persons, both of them, very knowledgeable, but they were not really strict. Their fantasies sometimes hoped for more than the facts could sustain. So we have simply no proper scholarly material on it, hardly any. As to the higher degrees, the significance of that is, again, that hardly any scholarly editions of primary text exist. We have later publications of the text of the Sheffield Royal Arch and Knight Templar Ritual, and we have the publication, the article by Nuke Jones and Hamer about the Flather manuscript, which is a part of the Royal Order of Scotland ritual, dated between 1718 and 1800. And that's all. I haven't been able to find anything more. There is, again, hardly any scholarly secondary literature, probably also because there is hardly any edition of the primary material available. The higher degrees themselves, the British higher degrees, have, with one exception, two sources. On the one hand, the Howardine material, the Moners and the Ancients didn't want the Howardine to exist, but they plundered their rituals to abstract higher degrees from it. And the other source is Pierre Lambert de Lintot. Pierre Lambert de Lintot was a Frenchman, an engraver, who lived in London, was a member of one of the about 12 French-speaking lodges in London, and he practiced in his lodge what he called the rite of 7 degrees. Now that's a French expression. It is an English translation of a French expression. In France, in the 18th century, every lodge that respects itself works in a rite of 7 degrees. Now, which 7 degrees that are is very, very, very variable. And Pierre Lambert de Lintot added them all up. So it's rather 15 degrees in our modern understanding that he was working, but he called it the rite of 7 degrees. So it's French material which he imported to London and exported from London to the British Isles. We know it explicitly from Ireland that he exported through members of his lodge degrees from his system to Ireland. The one exception I mentioned is the Royal Arch. The Royal Arch is a very, very difficult story, the history of the development of the Royal Arch ritual. As I see it at the moment, you can find early material which we now, with hindsight, say that's typical Royal Arch in both Ireland and England in the 1740s, 50s, but they are elements, symbols, fragments. With the export of Freemasonry to France, these elements go to France. And in France, we find in the middle of the 18th century, around 1750, quite a large number of manuscripts containing the manuscript, the ritual of a Royal Arch degree. All those manuscripts are very, very similar. So it seems to be rather constant in its form at that moment. From our current perspective, with hindsight, it's very recognizable as the basis for the modern Royal Arch ritual, but there was material added to it when it came back to England, possibly through Pierre Lambert de Lintot. It was one of the degrees in his system. Finch book from 1802, which is in volume 2, in volume 2, adds a section with the story of the banners, which is absent until 1802. It was introduced by Finch in 1802. The lectures of the principals were added in the course of the 19th century. And what is significant, of course, is that in the course of this history, the book which was found in the vault under the Sanctum Sanctorum changes. At first, it is the Gospel of St. John, and that is a miracle to find the Gospel of St. John in a vault under the Sanctum Sanctorum. But that somehow became too irrational to late 18th, early 19th century English Freemasons, and they changed it into the beginning of Genesis, which of course is not a miracle, it's rather obvious. So that changes the essence of the ritual really dramatically.
Hi, Jan. Andreas speaking here again. I think we should make we should make a cliffhanger here and and allow you to say some final words and then round up.
Give me 5 minutes.
Okay, sure.
I dropped my second example, but I would like to finish my first example.
Okay, sure, yeah? Great. Thank you.
So I talked about Lambert de Lintot. He was an engraver, and Neville Barker Cryer mentions in his publications about the Haredim that there is in the north of England still a lodge who inherited circular tracing boards from a Haredim lodge that doesn't exist anymore. Now, what we see here is an engraving by Lambert de Lintot called Freemasons at Work. When you look above at the top, you see here where my cursor is now. You can see my cursor? Yeah? You see my cursor? Yeah? Okay, good. You see that the letters HRDM, which is the normal way of writing the word Haredim or Heredom. So he is making him engraving pertaining to the Haredim work. We have in the middle the cherub, which is the master. On the left side, the first, and on the right side, the second warden. The master has in his right hand the square. The first warden has in his left hand the level, and the second one has in his right hand the plumb line. So we see here that they stand around a circular tracing board, recognized as a tracing board by its zigzag border. Types of documents, printed text and manuscripts. I leave that. Smith's book M is not a ritual, but it's our presentations by Masons, for Masons in Haredim lodges. I go over it. Here. I told you that Preston introduced lectures. Now, he didn't allow those present in his Lodge of Antiquity #1, where they were performed, to write anything down about it. But those who visited there wrote something down in manuscript nevertheless when they came home. We have quite a number of those manuscripts. In 1810, they were for the first time published. And now you can see here a page of those publications. And you understand directly, if you don't know the text by heart, you cannot read those documents. These are not publication rituals. These are just help to remember the order in which you have to say the things, but which things you have to say, you have to know already. In 1778, Preston got in trouble with the Grand Lodge. He was kicked out and founded his own Grand Lodge of England south of the River Trent. That had two lodges. He was the master of Lodge #2, and Lambert de Linthout was the master of Lodge #1. So they were cooperating there already. In 1787, Preston founded his own Order of Haredim within English Freemasonry. So you had to be an English Freemason in order to be able to become a member of his Order of Haredim. And I'm convinced that the Dalziel manuscripts about which I wrote were made for this Order of Haredim. Why I'm convinced of that? There was someone, Brother James, who published in Ars Quater Coronatorum the lectures of Preston, the syllabus. He gathered all the material he could find and he reconstructed how those lectures should have looked like. Now, if you compare his text with the Dalziel manuscript, then what we see is that the text for the first degree is virtually identical. Given the way how the syllabus was reconstructed, it's not a wonder that they are not completely identical. That for me is the proof that the material in the Dalziel lectures was written by Preston. When we compare it for the second degree, it is still recognizable, but quite different. And when we go to the third degree, we have two completely different texts. So for his Haredim order, he wrote a completely new, very different Haredim text. And that is very esoteric in the literal sense of the word, that it is sharing among the members some pseudo-knowledge which is not known outside. For example, what was Hiram killed for, the architect of the temple? The Dalziel text manuscripts say, the grand secrets revealed to the noble, relative to the noble insect Sherma, was that which constituted the secrets of the three Grand Masters and which Hiram a bit lost his life for, not illegally revealing to the three Tyrian assassins. Now, I think no normal Freemason has ever heard of the noble insect Sherma. And even the Dalziel lectures do not say more about it than just this. So I assume that there was a kind of oral explanation by Preston himself to those select members that he confronted with this. I assume that Finch, whom we met already before, belonged to this group. He had his own publishing house where he published new versions of the developing rituals, that the development that took place at the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century, when the two Grand Lodges were growing together. Now, there is one of the editions, that is his biographer, refers to it as an edition, which was not printed, not even printed in his own private printing house. He copied the copies by hand. Now, the number of readers for which that edition was meant must have been very small. And in that edition, that handwritten manuscript, of which we have one copy, we find the explanation. It says, the insect called Sherma was procured by King Solomon in the following wonderful manner. He, knowing the language of all the creation, and knowing also by divine inspiration that none but the vulture could assist him in this critical emergency, he ordered a large glass to be made in imitation of a beehive, and a nest of young vultures to be procured, over which he placed this glass. The older vultures, returning and finding her young ones in confinement, flew to procure this Sherma and laid it on the glass in order to liberate her young ones, when instantaneously the glass was separated by the wonderful properties of this inestimate insect. So the glass broke in two. That's the idea. King Solomon went immediately and seized this Sherma, and with it he caused Hiram Abiff to cut and shape stone. Now, as I said, one of the two people who I know that really studied this material was John Yarker, and he was not satisfied by this text. He wanted to know where it came from. And he found in the Talmud that it says that Solomon summoned Ashmodens, one of the old Jennies, in virtue of his command over the Jennies, and received from him the secret of this insect, by which he was enabled to communicate the high polish to the dressed stone. So what we see is that Preston took this story of the Talmud, transformed it in the way he needed, and then had it as one of his secrets within his inner secret order of the Harudim. I think this is a nice point to stop and to say, you can see what kind of strange things Freemasonry can produce, and it's really fun.
Wonderful, Jan. It is great, and it only proves how deep we can go with the edition of the source text and having experts talking to us about them. So actually, we could have, I would say, 5 events, one on each volume, certainly. But time is running out very much so. So we have to, I'm happy for your patience, those who are still with us here. And I think without further ado, we should move to the questions that have been asked to us. And the first one who was active in asking a question is John Belton. So I'd like to give John Belton the word, please.
Right, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes. Right. Well, all 3 of you, congratulations. It's a tremendous work, and it's not till you get into it, you find just how much of a challenge it must have been to do it all. But I'm interested to read, it's a question really to Rob. I've managed to work through the pandemic, getting materials from the 18th century online, but they're very difficult to lay your hands on. How many ways can you spell Freemason or Freemasons with or without hyphens, and it can get quite difficult. So are we going to, at some stage, see some benefit coming out of your digital explorations? And the other thing is just to wonder why there is no Masonic library yet, which is actually hosting those volumes which are readily available, so that they are a resource to be used. What does the future post-pandemic hold? Some future for that sort of hope? That's the question.
Excellent. Who wants to pick up that one? Róbert, maybe?
Yeah, I'm happy to answer it. Well, I'm more than happy to share with you my experiments with searching the word Freemason. I think I've got about one.
Oh, Róbert, you're not hearable anymore.
I was.
How many ways you could spell it?
Yeah.
There you broke off.
Okay, you could, I mean, if you look at the OCR errors, optical character recognition errors in the different collections, I think I collected about 100 different spellings of the word Freemason. I'm more than happy to share this list with you to help your search. But I read your question that you posed on the chat, and well, the availability of the 18th century resources is really limited online, I would say. It really depends on the research question that you'd like to ask. Just one example, during the research on this 5-volume edition, I managed to identify 56 books and pamphlets which are not even recorded in the English short title catalog. Cengage, the biggest digital company that has digitalized basically all the pamphlets and newspapers of the long 18th century, only digitalize a small portion of 18th century books. I think now they are coming out with the third ECHO 18th century conline, in which it would, I think, contain about 90,000 books that have never been available online. So this is well, a problematic issue. In digital humanities, this problem is called offline punemic, because you think that many sources are available online, but this is far from the case. Just another fact, the British Library digitalized only 7% of the newspapers of his collection. So we are very far from reaching the comprehensive digital collection of newspapers themselves. Okay.
Thank you.
Are you happy with that answer, John?
Yes, that's fine. Thank you.
Fine, excellent. I have two questions that I will ask to the panelists in one, and see if anybody of you would like to pick that up. So Rhea Yigit asks what role Robert Walpole played in the Grand Lodge, and my question would be that you would not say anything in general, but if there's anything in the volumes that could shed light on this. And the second question from Hasu Joshi, which we kind of have touched upon, to shed light on the Grand Lodge south of the Trent and why the group broke away. I think Jan already shortly mentioned that, but is there anything in your volumes that can shed more light on Robert Walpole? And is there anybody who wants to say something a minute about the Grand Lodge south of the Trent? Cécile, is that an answer from you, or do you also have a question?
You have to unmute.
You have to unmute yourself.
Can you hear me now? Yes, there is actually an entry on Robert Walpole in our dictionary, Le Monde Maçonnique, but unfortunately there is no evidence, there is no documented evidence that he was a Freemason. So you will find the details. He was certainly influenced by Freemasonry. He had many friends who were Freemasons, but we have no documented evidence of his actually being a Freemason right? And of course, the Grand Lodge south of Trent, no, I think Jan can answer that one better than me, but I just wanted to say that in volume 1, I published an extract from the State of Facts of William Preston, which was really the incident which led to William Preston's quitting the Grand Lodge and founding the Grand Lodge south of the River Trent. Okay.
Right, excellent. Jan, would you like to spend a minute to elucidate more about the lodge south of the River Trent?
Yeah, please. We know pretty detailed what happened around the time that William Preston was kicked out of the Premier Grand Lodge. It's a too complicated story to tell now, but it's known in pretty much detail. When he was kicked out, he was, of course, too much active Freemason, and beside that, about half the brethren of his lodge stood behind him. So he took them with him and founded his own lodge. And then with Lambert de Linto together, they founded this Grand Lodge of England south of the Trent. They asked permission from the York Grand Lodge, and the York Grand Lodge granted them permission to create that Grand Lodge actually as a province under the York Grand Lodge. It was never an independent Grand Lodge, it was always a province under the York Grand Lodge. And with that permission, he actually behaved completely as if he was independent, but he had only those 2 lodges, which lasted until Preston was returning to the Lodge of Antiquity #1 of the Premier Grand Lodge. At a certain point, he was allowed again to come back. So then the Grand Lodge south of the River Trent disappeared again. The brethren that had been active there were integrated in the modern Grand Lodge. However, Preston was never asked to participate in the creation of the new rituals for the United Grand Lodge of England, which has surprised scholars always to a high extent. He was the expert on Masonic ritual in England per se, but nevertheless, he was not on those committees. I think he was never completely pardoned for the problems he had had, never completely pardoned for creating an independent 3rd Grand Lodge besides the ancients and the moderns. They didn't really like him. And on the other hand, quite a number of people who were on the committee came from the Lodge of Antiquity, which was Preston's lodge, and where he influenced them very strongly. So through those members, he was influencing the new ritual anyway.
Thank you so much. We have Ozan. Yeah. Okay, thanks a lot. We have Ozan Arslan, who has raised his hand and has waited for his question. Please.
Thank you. Great presentations. Thank you very much for that. The last year's open lectures were concluded in December by a very impressive conference of Cécile Révauger. And I believe, today is a very good start to a new year, especially after the Annus Horribilis of 2020. So Róbert Péter actually mentioned in his presentation the story of 2 quote-unquote Turkish shoemaker brethren in the 1780s, if I'm not wrong. And that's a particularly interesting story, actually, because there were, of course, Masonic lodges founded in the Ottoman Empire from the 1720s on. And there was actually even a Scottish lodge founded in Aleppo in 1747. and several Ottoman envoys, members of diplomatic legations and ambassadors sent to European capitals throughout the 18th century, they were initiated into craft lodges. But in 1780s, two Turkish shoemaker brethren, I mean, that is really a very interesting, very fascinating story. And actually also the term Turkish or Turk in the 18th century is rather an umbrella term, actually. So any Muslim from the Ottoman Empire, so from Algeria, from Crimea, from Egypt, from Syria, from Bosnia, they would be all actually perceived and called Turks. So could Róbert Péter tell us a little bit more, because he also rightly mentioned that actually that would be of interest to many Turks in the audience, just like myself.
Thanks a lot for this comment and question. Well, the sources that I had about the admission of these two Turks, father and son, the ones that I quoted in my lecture, unfortunately, that's only what we know about their membership. I'm more than happy to send you the book. I'm not okay. I'm not muted. You could hear me. So I'm more than happy to send you the book in which I found the reference. There are some more details about their membership and why they were admitted into several Edinburgh lodges, because they were not only members of St. Luke's, but several other lodges. They were quite popular in Edinburgh, but we don't even know their surnames. We know their Christian names, but we don't know their surnames. So I can't, unfortunately, add any novel information apart from the sources that I have. But if you send me an email, I'm more than happy to send you the sources, the primary sources.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yes, may I have a short comment about Róbert Walpole?
Yeah, 1 second. I just wanted to say that Cécile had unfortunately to leave us because she had to leave for another meeting in Martinique tonight, or this afternoon for her. So we weren't able to say farewell to her, but we will certainly communicate with her. And yes, Róbert, if you want to say something about Róbert Walpole, please, if we can elucidate anything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Walpole's name is not mentioned in the minutes at all. In that sense, of course, Cécile was right. I think in the dictionary, Matthew Scanlon wrote the entry on Walpole, and I remember that he mentioned, and the last volume also has an article about the admission of Walpole in 1731. During his initiation, the Grand Master Lovell was also present. And the report about Walpole's admission was also published in several newspaper articles, both ministerial and opposition newspapers. So in that sense, there was an agreement among the opposition and the governmental authorities about his initiation. And what we know is that in 1733, Walpole financed a governmental newspaper which was called Freemason. Right? This was the name of the newspaper. It was a short-lived paper. I think it existed only for 3 months. And as far as I recall, it was run by John Henley, who was a member of Walpole Secret Service. And it published humorous articles about Freemasonry. Some of the issues, I think it had only about 15 issues, are available in the Library and Museum of Freemasonry in London. That's it.
And some of them were translated to German, Róbert.
Okay, I didn't know that.
I can tell you, that's super interesting. But the discussion is going on. We have some people leaving the room, but is there any evidence that emerges from the material that you have amassed in the volumes of Désaguiers and his potential influence on early Masonic ritual? Could you hear me? Anybody wants to pick that up? Is there any mentioning of Révauger and his influence on early Masonic ritual?
It is a question for Jan, definitely. He is the authority on this.
Yeah. And Jan has muted himself, so I guess the answer would be no.
No, sorry, I didn't mute myself. Someone muted me. I don't know why, but I'm back again. No, I haven't found anything. I'm sorry. I would have been delighted, but no.
Exactly. And we have a rather big question, which about is there any information that you have found about the social composition of lodges that has emerged from the material in the volumes?
That goes to Róbert.
Okay, thanks. Well, I can recommend you a book in which and there is an excellent chapter about the social composition of Freemasonry in the 18th century. This is written by Péter Clark, British Clubs and Societies. Right? This is the book. I think it came out in 2000, and there is an excellent chapter about the social compositions of Freemasons.
And the findings in your volumes, do they kind of underpin the findings of Clark? I mean, I remember reading some of the newspaper contributions, for instance, in that vein, that you could demonstrate this was not only high aristocracy, that there was a kind of broad participation, stuff like that. So would you say that the material that you have in your volumes would support the thesis that Clark does in his book? Well,
I'm not really dealing with social history, but definitely Clark was right in many ways about the social composition of Scottish Freemasonry. It was quite different from the social compositions of English Freemasonry. I think Clark was also right with regard to the Catholics in Ireland among Freemasons. At the moment, I can't think of any challenges that are addition posed to Clark's views about the social composition of Freemason, but I have to reconsider it. I didn't have a look at this material from this perspective.
Excellent. With these words, I would like to conclude the panel session. I would like to thank all participants for their patience, and I hope that I don't have missed any questions. Otherwise, you know where the authors are, and you know where to find the volumes and how to read them. So you can engage in stimulating discussions with the volume editors, and most certainly I think every one of us has a very good inspiration of how deep we can go with the source material about Freemasonry in the 18th century. And that's truly the fascinating thing, because I mean, we could basically move over to France or to Germany in the same time period, and we would also be able to produce 5-volume works. So it's really fascinating, and I'm so happy that this project that we once upon a time, yeah, Rob Collis is also here. I think we made a memorable trip down to London where we had our first contacts with the publishers Pickering at Sh2, that we now can sit here 10 years later and look at these 5 volumes, say, oh, what a great work we did back in the time. So thanks a lot for all panelists of being here. Thank you for your hard work in selecting these fascinating sources. Thank you participants for interesting and intelligent questions that stimulated for a good discussion. So that would be my final words. And again, with a recommendation to back to the sources. I'm not sure if the organizers of the open lectures would like to say something at this stage. If you would like to come in. So if not, then thank you so much for tonight. And see you again soon. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Have a good time. Thank you.